Hi everyone, welcome to our open news meeting. I'm James Harding. I'm the editor and co-founder of Tortoise. And if you wonder who does our music, it's Mark St. Andrew. And by the time we get to the end of 2022, I suspect the only person still having a good time is going to be Mark, setting the music for a world in total chaos, as the news provides more and more material for him and a good deal of bewilderment and despair to everyone else. Welcome this evening. I'm going to kick off, if I might, just by asking everyone the answer to two questions. One is, would you raise your hand, right? And you know by now the way Zoom works, you go to that reactions tab and you press any button. Would you raise your hand if you think that there will be a new Prime Minister by Conservative Party conference in September? I'm giving everyone a little bit of time. Well, and just out of interest, in order that, we're getting somewhere. Okay. Well, I'm gonna come in a moment to a couple of people who just I can see have sort of got their screens on. If you want to speak, do keep your screen on because I'm going to make sure to come to you. And literally, I can see at the moment I said that people started switching their screens off. I'm not sure that's the way this is supposed to work, but I'm going to come to a couple of people in a moment on that exactly that subject. All right, and the second question: do you think that Labour will win the next general election? Put your hands up if you think Labour will win the next general election. All right, well, let me start with, I just want to hear a couple of views, because the way I'd love to do this evening's meeting is, I think there's a lot of swirl around what's happening inside Downing Street. And we, for a bunch of reasons that will become clear later in the year, have been talking to Peter Kellner, thanks to Lara Spirit and Kim Darroch and Alexandra Musavidze. We've been thinking about how do you track democracy in the UK. And as a result of that, Lara flagged up something that I hadn't read but should have done, which was Peter Kellner's report for the Blair Institute about changing demographics. And I was overwhelmed by how difficult politically and ideologically it is for Labour to win. And so I thought it would be quite interesting if we can today just to use the first half of our open news meeting to talk about British politics, either in the weeds of what's happening in Downing Street or the big picture of what's happening in the UK. And then do the second half, if you like, for AOB. Any other business, any other story that anyone wants to bring in. There are a few other big themes that we're looking at. We've been looking at Meta and the metaverse and the question of the next stage of the attention economy and tech state sense maker. It's well worth looking at. Giles Whittell, as you've seen, is running a kind of regular season on the global decline in democracy and the tenacity of tyrants. So what's happening there, I think, is an interesting subject, but people might have others they want to come to. But I just want to, I want to stick with politics just for the start. So Charlotte, can I come to you? I think you had your hand up with thinking that Labour will win the next general election, but just to prove to you that a middle-aged man can't do two things at once, I can't remember what you said about whether Boris survives.
I mean, I didn't put my hand up for Boris, whether Boris would have gone, mainly because it seemed my opinion of that changes from day to day. So right. Like just now, he seems to be sort of, I mean, it is still massively chaotic, but he's such a survivor that I don't feel confident that the Tory party is going to have the kind of courage to get rid of him. But a lot hinges on the May elections, I think. Labour winning.
Labour, you think will win. So just explain.
I mean, it's probably blind optimism.
Right.
But I think the cost of living stuff is really bad, and I think the government hasn't nailed it. And I think that the Treasury tightening the strings on things means, for all the kind of good words and spin that's going on about what everything they're going to do, I think the reality for people on the ground, it's not going to filter through. So I think Labour has a chance of winning. I think against that, obviously, is things like boundaries changing, and just as I haven't read the thing that Laura put up, but I think it is electorally really hard for Labour to win outright. But I think they might get the largest vote and then might be able to form a government. But I think there is some wishful thinking there.
Okay, Charlotte, thank you. We're going to market something new, which is a feeling, where we just get together and we share what our feelings are about British politics in sounds and word. I want to, if I might, also just ask Chris Cregan, because Chris, I couldn't see. I think you didn't put your hand up on Labour winning the next election. Am I right?
I'd only just joined, so.
Oh, I see. So sorry, Chris. The question was at the start was, did you think Boris would survive, and did you think Labour would win the next general election?
I think Boris will survive, and I'm not at all sure that Labour will win the next general election.
Okay. If people, I'm going to try and just sort of scroll through the chat, because there are lots of interesting thoughts. I can bring a few other voices in, but I'm going to just hand over to Laura for a minute, just on this Tony Blair, on this Peter Clement report.
Yeah.
Laura, will you just talk through it, particularly point about class and the overall vote? And will you,
sure.
Our beloved colleagues.
Beloved colleagues, can you? Sorry, it's very busy newsroom.
Okay.
Sorry, James. Yeah. So this report, which was done by a friend of ours, Peter Kellner, just before Christmas for the Tony Blair Institute, is essentially about, it's sort of building the red bridges to the red wall, I think it's called, from red walls to red bridges, rebuilding Labour's voting coalition. And it paints quite a challenging and grim picture, as you will have noticed, about what kind of vast distances needs to be travelled by any Labour Party in order to win the next election. So more than 11 million former Labour voters failed to vote for the party in 2019, and 5.5 of those went to the Conservatives, 2.5 to anti-Brexit parties. And I think the staggering statistic in that was that 4 in 10 Conservative voters in 2019 who had voted for Labour at some point in their lives voted for Conservatives in 2019. And it's not actually as simple as the traditional narrative that I think many of us have around Labour losing the red wall and losing those kind of so-called heartlands. It actually paints a kind of, the reason why I think the report is so interesting, why I'd recommend people to read it, is because it paints a very interesting picture about the way that kind of class is changing, the way our lives are changing, and the way that what used to be seen as the kind of traditional Labour bloc as a group doesn't exist in the same way that it used to. So, for example, white collar workers now outnumber manual workers by 4 to 3. Obviously, we know that this kind of class realignment and this change has happened, but I think we haven't thought in such stark terms enough about just how much Keir Starmer and his colleagues are going to have to do before the next election. So the other interesting part about that, which I know you picked up, is this question of where people place themselves on the political spectrum, and 2/3 of those who switched from Labour in the last election place themselves in or near the political centre. So I think obviously, you might say that you can see why Tony Blair would quite like this report, but I think it's very difficult to argue with the figures when you look at them, and I'd recommend people to do that. So I think we were looking at this and have been looking at this in recent days, as I think many people have, in trying to wonder why Labour haven't managed to capitalise slightly more on what has essentially, since the Owen Paterson affair, so a couple of months now, just been a government lurching from crisis to crisis. And I know we did this thinking about Keir and Angela, but many people would say that they would expect Keir to be performing better than he has been. And I think we're having this discussion about what Labour's and Rachel Reeves' policy should be. There were some interesting things in here as well. I'm sorry to go on, but there was this question about, as you picked up on, the people that should be voting Labour think that they are getting less in their money for public services than others, and that I think makes for, especially in the context of the cost of living crisis, I think makes for quite interesting reading and discussing. So I'm glad we brought this up, and I'm quite interested to hear what people have to think about it.
So Laura, thank you. I saw that our relatively new colleague, Max Rebuck, has just joined, makes a point about Scotland. So I'm going to come to Max about that in a moment. And I think my colleague Gajinder is here, who's probably spends too much time late into the night worrying about the future of Labour. So I'm going to see if I can bring Gajinder in as well. But for those people who haven't read it, and it's happily one of those political reports that's actually in depth but not too long.
Yeah, it's brilliant.
There were two things I thought that really stood out that are, if you are Keir Starmer, Rachel Reeves, that front bench team, I think are really complicated. One is that there's one extraordinary comment about the end of class in the UK and the observation that middle class people are more likely to join a union today than working class people, right? ABC ones versus CDEs. Middle class people are more likely to work in a workplace of 100+ people rather than working class people, who are more likely to work in smaller, medium-sized businesses. And middle class people are more likely to self-identify as left of centre than working class people, right? Which helps explain why in 2019, what remained of the Labour vote was more middle class than working class. So that tells you something, I think, about the scale of the problem structurally. And then the most interesting thing, I think, and maybe this is kind of Peter Kellner talking to Tony Blair about the things that they deeply believe and then find in the data. But the other thing that it points out is that there is a real ceiling in terms of both working class and middle class, but predominantly working class, with the idea of a quote unquote socialist agenda, right? That doesn't have traction either in terms of cultural politics on woke issues or on economic politics, given that most people, middle class and working class, feel they put more money into tax than they get out of public services. And so I just raise all of that because at the moment, you might think if you were Labour, we suddenly have a momentum given anger in the country around the Prime Minister. But if you thought about it for more than a couple of minutes, I think you'd come away thinking, we have a fundamental problem here, which is how do we remake ourselves as a party of the centre, and what does that actually even mean in policy terms? So I'm interested. My colleague Kerry Thomas is here too, and I'm gonna come to Kerry in a moment too. Max, let's just touch on the Scotland point though. You were making a point about what I presume it being unwinnable without Scotland.
Yeah. Thank you. I think first time I've spoken at one of these thinkings, so it's good to jump in. Just really the question, and can Labour really win without Scotland? I think it's interesting to look at kind of percentage votes, but in the end, we are obviously first past the post, and it's 54 seats at the moment, which is quite a big chunk for Labour. I'm not sure historically if they've won without Labour, won without Scotland, so just worth obviously fact checking that. I'm not sure if that's 100% true. But also, I think the way that the government is behaving and the narratives that are around it in terms of nepotism and democracy, I was about to say corruption, but democracy, just feeds into the emotional narrative of Scottish independence and will strengthen that narrative much more. And as we've seen with Brexit, it's not necessarily an economic argument that wins out. It can be an emotive one. And then also, I'm just not sure that Scotland are really, or Labour, sorry, are really reaching Scottish voters or offering a platform that probably talks enough about de-evolution to really, and strengthening de-evolution to really make an attractive proposition to bring Scottish voters back in. I think it's still quite reactionary to the government and obviously COVID, and perhaps they're holding things back for the next 2 years and they're going to go on and on, hopefully. But it feels still too responsive, and it doesn't feel like there's enough conversation about how does the union really operate away from just Westminster, which is what I think Scottish independence and possibly the Welsh movement might be looking to discuss.
I think we ran actually before you join, Max, a piece a couple of years ago on this whole question about Wexit and whether or not it's also going to be a force in politics. Kerry did that at the time. And Kerry, I'm going to come to you in a moment, but I see that Kevin Flanagan's got his hand up. So Kevin, I want to hear what you think on all this.
Well, I think, speaking as an expat, first of all, I have to put my cards on the table. I was actually back only to visit briefly when the Brexit vote happened, and I was stunned about who was voting for it. But I think the really big question is Labour missed a chance to put PR, in, which would have hobbled the Conservatives, and would have changed the nature of politics in this country. And I wonder whether or not that's the really big question, because I think if I was to read it from here, I would turn around and say that everything that they're doing at the moment is so divisive that I think they're pushing Indie Ref 2 to happen much sooner than it might otherwise have happened, and even Welsh Ref 1 might even happen. And I wonder, is there a bigger question? And I have to admit, if I was to summarize the political situation, Labour is looking for the Tories to lose the next election, not to win it. That's the impression I get listening. Very worthy stuff, but it's not election winning stuff.
Sorry, what's not election winning stuff? Sorry, Kevin.
Well, basically the way the Labour Party is conducting itself at the moment, it just, it's very worthy, and they're making good points, but they're up against an orator, right? A rhetorician. I mean, he's just, it's all about rhetoric, and they're not, they're trying to play their game, but they're not in Paris. They don't get to do that. They have to play the game the hand they're dealt, not the hand they want. And there's a little bit, if you had Keir Starmer up against Boris Johnson debating, who's going to win that.
I think that's right, but I suppose also one of the reasons why we were interested in this, in the findings of this report, is even beyond the rhetoric. When you get to the kind of hard policy of the thinking, are they going to do enough? Can they do enough to reposition the party? Kevin, thanks. I'm going to bring in a few other voices. Firstly, I want to bring in Gajinder. Gajinder, I know that you spend the small hours of the night worrying about the repositioning of the Labour Party. So what do you think? So, I didn't actually see whether you put your hand up to say you think Boris will survive or whether you think Labour will win the next election. What do you think? Oh, make sure you're unmuted. Make sure you're unmuted.
Sure. Thank you, James, for that introduction. It's been an interesting few months, because I guess this time 6 months ago, I would have probably thought, how do we kind of get ahead of this government and beat it? But there have been so many mishaps over the last 6 months that I think that there is a realistic chance for Labour potentially winning over a lot of the seats that we might not have even considered before, particularly in the southeast. It won't be necessarily easy, but I guess this government's just shown it's not very capable or competent. I agree with some of the other speakers who say that Boris is great at oracy and kind of turns it into something that shouldn't be kind of the most important topics. But I reckon if Keir Starmer carries on kind of showing some competent and kind of capable leadership in comparison to what we have today, there is a chance that in the future that the electorate might be more willing to go for, I guess, what used to be seen as good qualities like strong leadership and credible kind of economic plans. If you look at the energy kind of crisis right now, I feel the Chancellor has missed a good opportunity to rectify it, and it's kind of putting a plaster on a bigger issue. But I guess it's very hard for the opposition to come up with practical policies at the right time without the machine of the civil service. But I'm hoping that given how weak this government is, there is an opportunity for Labour to kind of show some more of its thinking and vision.
It is. I'm just interested. As you were speaking, I was sort of caught short by the comment from Victoria Powell, and I can't see Victoria, so if I can, I would look you in the eye and say, actually, no. Above all, Victoria, when we set up Tortoise, one of our ambitions was to make sure that we didn't have a newsroom that was aligned to any political party or would carry water, frankly, for any political party. But the reason why this interests us, or it certainly interests me so much, is because it feels as though you've got on the right a commitment to a level of financial or fiscal prudence that can't afford to deliver on the promises it's making, levelling up, etc. And on the left, you've got what Gajinda just described, is a sort of seeming inability to come up with any new practical economic plan that either shifts the dial politically or in policy terms. So actually, no, the reason for trying to frame the conversations we did is to try and understand where new thinking on policy happens and where and how Britain changes rather than actually picking sides. So I can't see Victoria, but if that helps answer your question, yes, it does. There, I can see you just about. Oh, I can see you there. Do you want to weigh in, Victoria? Oh, we can't hear you. We can see you now. I think
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, far away, far away.
No, it was good to just understand that and get clarity on it. It just seemed a little unclear from earlier statements. So yeah, no, good to understand that.
You know, but the funny thing is, I used to work in newsrooms where we used to kind of talk and worry aloud for ages about which party to endorse. Not that those endorsements made the blindest bit of difference, but now actually we're free of that. We can sort of weigh in, dig in on each and every party. Ellen, the comment that Kevin made and that Max made about Scotland, what's your view on where this current round of politics and if you like, the Tory end of it more than the Labour end, drives politics in Scotland?
Yeah, hi James. I mean, speaking full disclosure, as yes, someone raised as a Scot, but who hasn't lived there for a while, and I know that quite a few of our Tortoise members who are on tonight do indeed still live there. So we'd love to hear from them as well. But yeah, I think that, you know, Boris Johnson is such a big part of how conservatism is viewed in Scotland. That I wonder, you know, at the end of his eventual time in office, come, you know, whenever it does, how that will kind of change, you know, the narrative in Scotland and whether that will kind of have any impact on Labour's ability to cut through or the tactics that the SNP then pursue. Yeah, I think that'll be interesting to see, because he's been like the embodiment of English conservatism. I think from the Scottish viewpoint for a while now. But yeah.
I think it's we're due, aren't we, to go up and, you know, host some of our thinkings there. I feel more and more as though we're one of those newsrooms that's slipping into that trap of thinking about structural change in British politics and not being in the place where it's happening. So we'll make a point of doing that. I see Chris' hand and William's hands up. I'm going to come to them in a moment, but Kerry, I don't know whether I don't know whether you got a chance to see this Kellner report, but whether you did or didn't, what do you make of the answer to the questions? Does he survive? Does Labour win?
I mean, I think the interesting thing is that those two questions do seem to bear on each other, because I think the thing that seems to me really hard to argue is that the coalition of seats that won the Tories the last election could survive under, you think, definitely not under Rishi Sunak, because his economic instincts just don't line up with what you need to do to keep, you know, Mansfield and Guildford happy. It would take a mighty effort on Liz Truss's behalf to turn herself into the kind of person who could hold that together as well, though, you know, you can see her perhaps sort of trying to wrestle with that. So I think if Boris Johnson goes, then the job for the Tories becomes, in my mind, a lot harder, because actually a conversation I remember you and I having with the pollster Andrew Cooper more than 3 years ago now, where he talked us through, in the context of Brexit, the sort of shift, the tilt in the axis of politics away from old socioeconomic and class-based concerns towards more cultural and identity-based things. Now, that was at the time, that was a way of understanding the Brexit vote, but I think it seems undeniable that Brexit has reset the whole political landscape, and much more voting is now taking place along those cultural identity lines than the traditional Labour conservative tribal lines. and I think the challenge for Labour in part is what, absent the kind of factors that you mentioned in that report, the sort of workplace-based identity, the union-based identity, what cultural identity is Labour playing to? And for that reason, I think, actually, with the interesting exception of Wales, where Labour remains strong, in general, it seems to me Labour doesn't do well when it's up against a sort of rising tide of nationalism, whether that's Scottish nationalism or whether that's a kind of growing feeling of English nationalism in the sort of red wall seats or the north of England. So I think Labour somehow has got to figure out a sort of an appeal that also speaks to people's identity as well as to their economic interests, because that's really where the grain of the argument seems to me to be going.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, the one thing we haven't touched on, which is in the Kellner polling, is the same thing that actually, funnily enough, Liam Byrne talked about when he came to our thinking a few weeks ago about inflation and the likely impact on older people, the grey vote that have gone so predominantly for the Tories, is just the extent to which we are much more divided by age than by anything else. Younger Labour, older Conservative. And that does make me think that, in that sense, Blair's kind of anxiety around wokeism and kind of progressive politics is well-founded, because that older voting bloc is kind of much more traditionally patriotic in terms of values and self-identity. And I don't really still see what Labour says or thinks about such things that rings true. That feels like it's from the heart. Even when Keir Starmer, you feel like he's been scripted on that. Chris Cregan, I'm going to come back to you, and then I see William Jeremy's put his hand up, so William, I'll come to you in a minute too. Oh, and James Wilson, I'm going to come to you on the housing point, because it's a really good one. Chris.
Hi, yeah. Sorry, James, you kind of caught me on the hop slightly earlier.
But now you've gathered your thoughts. Now you're with us.
No, I'm with you. Sorry, I just joined. Look, I think Boris plays really badly for the Scottish Tories, plays really badly for Douglas Ross, even though he's taken the position he has, even though they've taken the position they have. And I think it plays really badly for them. And even if Boris goes, and I don't think there's any immediate sign of that, I think the collateral from that remains a real problem for the Scottish Tories. That plays to the SNP. It doesn't play to Labour. And for as long as we have this kind of constitutional stalemate, it's really tough for Labour to cut through, particularly as, you know, whilst they're in a much more stable, united, more credible position they've been for some time under Anas Sarwar and with a good front bench in the Scottish Parliament, they're not cutting through. I mean, arguably it was too late for them to cut through at the last Scottish parliamentary elections, but they're not showing signs of cutting through subsequently because they get squeezed. And they're going to continue to get squeezed while they have a problem with their position on independence. And of course, the recent arguments about whether or not they could have independents supporting candidates and so on. And they have to win back Labour votes from the SNP, who've now stuck with the SNP over, you know, 3 general elections over a considerable period of time. So I think it's really tough, all of that, really. And I'm speaking from Ed.
Is that what you're, Chris? I think that's the case. I think the interesting thing is also, what does a Scottish Labour Party need to do in order to beat the SNP might be quite different from what a Labour Party in England needs to do to beat the Conservatives. That is something I think if you were Starmer and Reeves, and I know I keep coming back to Rachel Reeves because I think she more than anyone is going to have to come up with an argument for what the domestic vision for Labour is. William, Jeremy.
Hi.
Hi, William. How are you?
Just with a couple of big picture reflection points. I've had a chance to give the Levelling Up paper a closer read. And I think there are some enormous and fundamental issues about the future of the country brought up by that paper, every bit as enormous as the introduction of the health service and the education service in the immediate years after the Second World War. And I think the Labour Party is going to have to find ways of grappling with that. And I also think that Boris is going to be removed at some point, possibly before the next election, by a Conservative Party that's really worried about the impact of populism, his brand, on the fabric of both the party and politics in general and the system, much as Matt has been writing about very eloquently. So seeing as political parties don't have a divine right to exist per se, I think there's a great deal of thinking about that goes beyond immediate polling, identity, party advantage. It's big, big stuff. And I know that's a bit of a grand sweep, but maybe a profile of Gove, both historically and where he is now, might help in understanding some of that thinking.
Funnily enough, you know, William, we talked, Kerry and I were talking, was about 6 months ago now, about whether or not you could do, and people might actually literally churn out of their subscriptions at this thought, but their memberships of Tortoise, sorry, at this thought, was that you would do a 6-part series on the politics of Michael Gove, because he's been there in every iteration of it. You know, compassionate conservatives, big society, you know, free schools and education policy, reform of the justice system.
There's a theme running through it.
Well, there is. The theme running through it is Michael Gove. It's not necessarily totally consistent. But I just think, because the effort to try and understand what is modern conservatism, it's sort of where Michael Gove is in any particular year. It's a kind of weird thing. Anyway, William, thank you. We will come back to that. James Wilson, can I just ask you, you're completely right about this housing point, and I totally missed it. I hadn't thought about it at all. Where did you get that stat about the 3 Tory constituencies?
It is in a New Statesman graphic, which I will pop in the chat now.
Work.
You're welcome. So, I mean, I just think it's fascinating that only 3 of the Tories' constituencies have home ownership below 50%. And the Kellner report, as Lara said earlier, you know, puts that forward in class terms in a very helpful chart number 7. The age factor is also a very important list, and it's indicative of how a lot of older voters have stuck with the Tories. But actually, there's a really interesting Economist article, which I'll put in the chat as well, which shows that in the red wall constituencies, because they're poorer than London and the southeast of England, the money goes a lot further, and they have some of the lowest housing costs in the country. And as a result, a great share of homeowners. So the coal pit at Peggs Wood is now flanked by 3-bedroom houses, which at half constructed developments start at under £200,000. And they can be bought with a 5% deposit thanks to a Help to Buy scheme, which has been done by the Tory government. So when it comes to homeowners, even the younger ones in what are classically thought of as Labour constituencies, the government has really, really rewarded them. So Labour really need to prize them away.
And I think, by the way, James, so this housing thing is, I think, really interesting. Also, we have it, I know, as you know, in the 10:30 meeting, this concern I've got that we're missing the whole critique of the Tories, not from the left, but from the right. Not, and I don't mean just sort of kind of David Frost, Lord Frost style critique, but your sort of basic CBI, Tony Danker, trend rate of growth is too low. You know, this is a Conservative government that doesn't get enterprise innovation, low taxation, business investment. And that feels like it opens up a massive space if you were the Labour Party, but it's a big space that they haven't yet stepped into. At least I don't seem to me as they haven't yet stepped into. We're going to wind up on British politics because people are going to be, I think, come to the end of their tether on that. But I know, let me just see if Zav is here, because Zav, are you there?
Yeah. Hi.
Zav, just to let you know, this whole conversation was more or less intended to as a sort of punch up over whether or not Labour needs to actively, loudly, kind of ostentatiously dump everything to do with Corbyn and what looks like old socialist left. And in saying that, as he switched off your screen, you might even have left.
No, I didn't leave. I had my camera off from the beginning.
Okay.
I mean, maybe speaking in slightly more general terms than you want, I do think, and I haven't read the Kellner report, so I don't know if I'm merely repeating stuff that's in there. I think one thing that Labour needs to do is identify what it means by working class when we're talking about working class, because it's obviously radically changed. I think Lara put a link to a bit of the Kellner report in the chat, but it obviously used to be miners and factory workers. Now it's hospitality workers, it's people who work in education, it's gig workers. It's I imagine more female than it used to be because there's much more women in the workforce. It's probably better educated than it used to be, given the massive rise of people who now go to university, and I think crucially as well, this is more kind of observational than kind of grounded in kind of hard data, although maybe it is. But there's, I think, maybe a higher tendency now than in the past for people who, economically speaking, might be classed as working class people to identify as middle class. And I do think that might be part of this discussion as to whether we should, if we're looking at how a party can win power, we should think of that party as kind of dropping socialism from the agenda. I mean, Joe Ruffles, I think, kind of put a good open question in the chat, which is, are we talking about dropping socialism, dropping the word socialism, dropping the policies of socialism? I personally think that a lot of these things are about framing, and I think you can see in some of the policies which the kind of Conservatives have pushed forward on, they've managed to succeed quite well in framing perhaps quite leftist policies as Conservative policies. And so I think there might be an argument to talk about socialism as little as possible, but I still think there's a world in which you can frame policies in a way that kind of correctly kind of convey their appeal without subscribing them to a kind of particular, ideological agenda. So those would be my broad thoughts, I think.
Zav, thank you. Joe, do you want to come back on that?
There. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, got you.
Well, actually, Zav picked it up really well, so I'm not sure I'll add a lot to it, except that socialism seems to be one of those words that produces a negative emotional response amongst a large percentage of the population, but they don't know what it means. And in fact, it can have very broad definitions. The Wikipedia definition, which I looked up in case you called on me, was essentially the means of production owned or regulated by the community as a whole. If that's socialism, there's a lot that fits into that. But people you can tell from my accent, I grew up in the States, and the people react to communism the same way there, but they don't know what it means. They just know it's bad. And so I think that we've seen in the UK a number of policies which might be considered socialist, which poll very well, but not under the banner of socialism. And that's why I put the question in. So that was why
I think the interesting thing, so I read this Kellner stuff, Joe, and then also this morning I was looking at Martin Wolf's column in the FT, which was a real assault on where the UK is, cost of living, and amongst many other things, the implication of this NICS, the social care levy tax rise, and Martin Wolf's view the combination of inflation and this tax rise being completely wrong, a mistake to raise taxes. The reason why I think it's really interesting is that the challenge, I think, for Labour is at a time when people are anti-taxation because of the cost of living. If anything, they're actually more than anything anti-state, anti-versions of common ownership or common regulation. And I think that puts Labour in a very difficult, puts Rishi Sunak in a difficult position, but it puts Labour in a difficult position too. And anyway, to go back to Victoria Powell's point, I think it puts us in an interesting one, because I think we're free to try and think about these things and think about some of the alternatives that we've got. I said at sort of the end of the first half hour, we're now 40 minutes in, so by my standards, that's pretty good timekeeping. I said that we were going to sort of move on to other things. I want to just pause and say, Emma Jackson's completely right. We should definitely get James Graham to write this whole thing as a play. My suggestion, though, is probably if there was ever a story to write, it was from, the sort of the pork pie plot to the moment that David Davis stood down, sort of 24 hours that seemed to be the moment of highest danger. And secondly, I was talking to someone who was following sentiment around politics, and they said, if you want to really understand the problem that Downing Street's got, and that team inside Downing Street, whether it's Gito Harry or Cansini or Levida or any of those, is they are so affected by the mood of the lobby, and public sentiment around politics moves suddenly and firmly, and then for a long time stays in the same place. And if you were Chris Huhne, people turned against you and then that stayed. If you were Dominic Cummings and you'd gone to Barnard Castle, that perception stayed. And that's really the difficulty that Boris Johnson and that team have got, is this thing is not going to naturally drift back. That was anyway the point that was made to me. With that, please do kind of keep that conversation going in the chat. But one of the things that Marks and Andrew, who runs our Think-Ins, was saying when we were talking this afternoon about them, is that even though we pride ourselves on being a slow newsroom, I think it can feel like a kind of gusher of information, that we just talk about things and they come at us quite fast, and we should slow down. And one of the things that I think that Giles and the team at SenseMaker have been doing is actually forcing us to stop for a bit with our kind of obsession around what's happening in UK politics and look at some of the things that are happening globally around democracy, but particularly around states that are not democratic and increasingly undemocratic. And Giles, I just wonder whether you'd talk through a little bit what the sort of occasional series on, I call them sort of the tenacious tyrants, but you maybe have a better phrase for them.
Stubborn survivors, but I think tenacious tyrants is better. But one way or another, it has to alliterate. Yeah.
So talk to what you've got to and what that says about the state of the world.
Yeah, and I'll keep my pickups from the conversation we've just been having to the end, because I'm quite cross about some stuff there. So we started with Syria, I guess 10 days ago, because I think it's worth noting that after 11 years, remember that started in 2011, Bashar al-Assad, whose time was called by Obama and all the other Western leaders within a few months of him starting to open fire on protesters in Damascus, is still there with the help of Putin, who's still there. And then his country, as we noted, has been carved up, but his lock on Damascus and Latakia and the west of the country is solid. He's not going anywhere. And as a sort of good primer in foreign affairs pointed out, the proof of that is that the rest of the region is reforging diplomatic links. Then briefly today, Ella wrote us a piece on how Maduro is still in position in Venezuela. You'll recall, I mean, the conviction in the West that Nicolas Maduro was on his way out 3 years ago was as solid as the conviction 2 weeks ago that Boris Johnson was on his way out. It was obvious. The irresistible force of liberal democracy was against him, and it was embodied in the person of Juan Guaido, who was articulate, Anglophone, handsome, had the backing of 60 countries in the CIA. Of course, Maduro was on his way out. We were completely wrong. And by the way, the pillars that have supported him in power, we itemized today: Iran, Russia, Turkey, Cuba, and really interestingly, it was a double header, and I had a quick chat with Christopher Sabatini at Chatham House before we pressed send on today's Sensemaker, and he pointed out the other factor that is easily forgotten in explaining Maduro's tenacity in power, which is Maduro. He's I think it's after the 7 o'clock threshold, so I can say he's a ruthless bastard. He, as Christopher said, he runs a criminal state and he runs it well. He knows how to terrify people. Interestingly, I think one of the tactics he uses is similar to that used by one of Putin's other henchmen, Ramzan Kadyrov in Chechnya, which is to get hold, if you want to manipulate an individual or terrify them into submission, just get hold of a family member and threaten their life. And then we hope to move on and do a similar treatment on Turkey, where if Turkish democracy was alive and well, Erdogan would no longer be there, but he is. And I think it's worth remembering in this same category, the demise of democracy in Myanmar and the fact that it's under threat, potentially in Ukraine, certainly in Taiwan, and perhaps if we continue with this series, as interestingly as anywhere, in Hungary, where membership of the EU would, in principle, indicate that democracy is alive and kicking as a condition of membership. But Orban is redefining democracy. There's a more sophisticated term for the version that he has brought in than managed, but it's a sort of illiberal democracy.
But the interesting thing is, isn't it, Giles? Because I think 5 years ago we talked a lot about pseudo democracies, right? But these ones, because I also thought the one other thing that you did was the look at the sort of wave of coups d'etats and military takeovers in Africa. And, I remember we had that thinking with David Miliband, who'd just done that piece on the age of impunity and this idea that that's what we're living with. But there is something that is really more than just the kind of undermining of, electoral integrity or rule of law. There seems to be a real trend overall in terms of encroachment of military powers, authoritarian powers in states around the world. And I don't know, and I know Freedom House keeps track of this, we all do keep track of it, but I don't know what that means for us journalistically, whether we should be just much more committed to reporting out, we talked about, I think, Myanmar yesterday morning, whether or not that we just have got to be much more committed in reporting those stories.
And the complexities of them. I mean, I've never been to Burkina Faso, and we're not necessarily in a position to send. But I think that's one of the most recent coup locations. And I think what's interesting there, just from reading agency reports, is that the military takeover has currently overwhelming popular support. This is not a small clique acting on its own behalf. It is a military clique acting on behalf of the army, but also on behalf of a disgruntled electorate, 20 million people, even though it's in the Sahel. Yes, Emma, we try to go for the complexities. We do nuance where we allow ourselves space. Where was I? Burkina Faso, and the point there, and the point I think across the Sahel. I'm not sure if the lessons of the Sahel are applicable globally, but certainly in much of sub-Saharan Africa, is that the democratically or apparently democratically elected governments have failed miserably to secure their people against jihadism, and we will have to wait and see what pattern those military takeovers take. Hitherto, the pattern has been that unfortunately military cliques become entrenched, and promises of genuine democracy, which are always made initially, are not kept. But the global pattern is miserable. And
on that note, Giles, before we lose you, I want to make sure that we just do one thing, which is your view on in that run of, tested democracies, what you think of what's happening in the UK.
You're not going to lose me, James. I'll be here to the bitter end. Well, first of all, I think it's not at all surprising that the greased piglet is still there. I think the contrast that you draw between the bubble and the country is absolutely crucial. I think that the most telling remark in the whole debate was from Sir Edward Lee from the back benches, asking for a sense of proportion. I'm not saying that I share his view. I am saying that his plea for a sense of proportion over what he described as staff giving the Prime Minister a piece of cake will have resonated outside the bubble in a way that the forensic examination of the parties and who was there and what they were doing won't have. But I don't think there's any doubt that the habit of lying in politics is draining the health of British democracy as it does anywhere else. I think that is a slippery slope.
So I suspect we're going to discuss that further. I want to use the last 5 or 6 minutes, if I can, just to go back to where we started, but in a little more detail, in that the reason why we were having this conversation with Peter Kellner in the first place is that we're trying to figure out how you cover the UK in a way that only a slow newsroom could. And if you take the view that, which is our sort of starting thought, which is, if you go to a press conference and there's more than one mic there, then it probably tells you that that story is overcovered and there are a bunch of stories that are not covered at all. So if you were trying to understand what's happening in terms of Britain and British politics, how do you get out of Westminster, out, not just outside of that particular bubble, but outside that agenda, and try and look at it more generally? And so we started out thinking, oh, well, could you have something that was directly around levelling up and, if you like, keeping tabs on the government? And I think you might get to a kind of Medici model metric, which is you're essentially just tracking the world that Michael Gove has created, and you'll pretty soon end up lost. And actually, when we started Tortoise, the thing that Kerry put his finger on was to say, look, we should really above all be about the power gap. That it's not just about economic inequality, but it's about the sense that some people have a greater control over their lives and the lives of others than many others do. And how does that work? And so we went to Peter to talk about this subject. Peter Kellner, was kind of one of these sort of, formidable polling figures, YouGov for all of those years, and try to ask the question, which is, what's the state of democracy in Britain, right? And the conversation we had was, well, if you were going to do a poll on that subject, how will you begin to understand accountability by geography, by age, by gender, by economic opportunity, by educational attainment? How would you understand accountability around, let's say, do you think the police do a good job? Do you think your NHS trust is accountable? Do you think that you have kind of meaningful impact on bin collection? Do you think that Britain answers your concerns about its place in the world? And at the end of the conversation, he said something I thought that was really interesting and really difficult. So I'm now just sort of farming it out to all of you. He said, what happens when people come to a pollster is that inevitably they start saying, well, we think the question should be this, or the question should be that. Do you trust your MP? Do you think that the local council is corrupt? He said, that's not your job in this. He said, your job as an editorial organization is to try and come to me as a pollster with a set of hypotheses about the way Britain is today, right? And then we can go out and frame questions that might get to the bottom of whether that's true. And so over the next couple of weeks, our job inside Tortoise is to try to come back to him with 10 to 12 theories of where we think Britain is at, right? So it may be Britain is in a century-long period of post-imperial decline, right? It's structural, it's not political, right? Or Britain is doing much better than it thinks it is. Or the monarchy is coming to its natural end with Queen Elizabeth II. I don't know, I'm just kind of rambling away here. But the reason I ask you is that I think most people here have my email, james@tortoisemedia.com, and they should certainly have Lara's too, and I hope we put in the chat, Lara. But if you've got theories of what that hypothesis should be, not the question, but what the hypothesis about Britain should be, that could help us inform a annual Democracy in Britain survey that we could put out to a really significant sample of people, I think it would be really helpful. It would help us inform the journalism that we do about a subject that was close to our hearts when we started Tortoise 2.5 years ago, which was the rules. How do we change the way in which our democracy works? So I don't know whether or not people have already answered this. Countries. Yeah, the value of John Harris, Chris has made some points. Well, I'm already getting some guidance. So here's that, if you like, is your homework. We will come back in the next few weeks and let you know what the hypotheses that we come up with. Hypothesis is a very grand word, but it's basically our sort of instinctive take on the issues of the UK. And then hopefully that polling effort, that survey effort, will enable us to better understand whether any of those things are true. And if we're really about anything, it's about whether any of those things are true. Is there anything that we've not touched on that people think we really should? Put it in the chat, raise your hand. Otherwise, I'm going to give you 2 minutes off for good behavior. Is that it? Oh, what's my email address, Louise? It's james@tortoisemedia.com. There we go. And Lars put hers in too. All right, all, listen, thank you very much for giving us your time this evening. We don't take that for granted. We hope that having this conversation helps us think a little bit through the swirl of news that we're all looking at. Have a very good evening. And tomorrow night, the Elgin marbles, the artists now known as the Parthenon sculptures, should they go back to Greece. Charles is editing. I expect that it will be a lively conversation that lives up to the spirit of civilized disagreement. See you at 6:30 tomorrow. Thanks so much.